All right, it is time for a book list of a top 10 or perhaps way more than 10 variety. Yes, yes, there's more than 10 here. Hey everyone, it is Shannon and I'm excited to be here today with my last video of 2017, and I'm going to be sharing with you my favorite books of 2017, and there are a lot of them. I don't. It's one of those things. It's like there were so many that I didn't even know where to start. But oddly, when I looked at my spreadsheet, there were only a handful that were 10 out of 10. But then my video would be done in like 5 minutes or 5 seconds. But then when I went to the 9.5, there were so many. And then I'm like, oh, if I'm going to include all of those, I should include some of these. So I don't know. This is a really long list. And I tried to have at least one per genre of like the types of books that I tend to talk about. And there's more in some categories than others. I think we should just get started. Let's just get started. And the first one is An Illustrated Life, drawing inspiration from the private sketchbooks of artists, illustrators, and designers. And this is by Gregory. And he has put together all of these sketchbooks and also writings from people, all different artistic lifestyles, and I love it so much. There's color stuff, watercolor, out in the field, from imagination, travel, memoir, comics, like there's everything. I absolutely adored this, and like it's amazing. It's amazing. And for me, this really reminded me that there is no one way to do a sketchbook, because I think I get sort of like the idealist image in my head of what a sketchbook should be. And I'm like, no, there are so many different ways that you can do it. And the most important thing is that you do it. Along the same theme, I also have Art and Fear. The observations on the perils and rewards of art making by Bayles and Ted Orland. I read this sort of halfway through the year, and I definitely am already ready for a reread, because what resonates with me is how much I connected with it at the time, but now I'm trying to think of how to explain exactly what it's about, and I'm like, yeah, not so much. But look, I did mark it up. I marked it up. I thought I didn't do that with any other books, but I did. Anyway, absolutely adored it, loved it, will reread it probably very soon. Probably very soon. Next up, I have some Canadian titles that I really loved. I enjoyed the poetry collection Milk and Honey by Rupi Kaur. And a lot of people have talked about this one. I read it on ebook. It would be great to have in physical format. It has a lot of works where the text and the type sort of create shapes, and there is a drawing as well. Some of it is white on black, some of it is black on white. It is very visceral and very, very emotional, and just extremely powerful. And I got it from the library, and I read it like through Adobe Digital Editions, which is actually fine for some poetry collections, because the collections don't tend to be that long. I find it hard to be at the computer and read, but it was totally worth it, and I'm so glad that I read it, and I'm looking forward to checking out her second collection. I also read the Canadian book Wenjack by Joseph Boyden, and this was another extremely powerful, emotional roller coaster. It follows a young boy who leaves a residential school and tries to get home, and it's told in very short chapters, and sometimes by him and sometimes by the perspective of the animals and the environment around him. And it was very, very powerful and very emotionally compelling. And it follows the same story, the same person as Gord Downey's The Secret Path, and that project. So it's about the same person. So it's heart-wrenching. It's a heart-wrenching. Also in the heart-wrenching land of things, I read the play The Wild Duck by Ibsen. I was inspired to read it because I watched a movie and on Netflix just randomly, and it turned out it was based on The Wild Duck. So I wanted to read The Wild Duck, so I read The Wild Duck, and The Wild Duck is amazing. I want to read more Ibsen. I'm working my way through Shakespeare, so mostly the plays I'm reading are Shakespeare, but it's a good reminder there's lots of other playwrights out there, and there's lots of other plays out there, and this one was a great story. I don't want to say anything about it because how it is told and how it comes together is quite beautiful, and I don't remember the sequence of events, so I'm just gonna leave it as a recommendation and a really powerful moving story. I also really enjoyed reading Twelfth Night by William Shakespeare. This is one that I had wanted to read since I was in grade 8. My class did Romeo and Juliet instead, which was fine. I like that story too, but I had always wanted to read Twelfth Night, so I finally got to read Twelfth Night, and I really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. It was a great story. It was a lot more understandable, I think, than some of the other plays. I think maybe I'm finally getting the hang of reading Shakespeare. I still need to see a production of it. I don't know if there's any kicking around, but that's goes on another list. That's on another list. Let's stick to this list. And go out in the world, out into outer space, into the land of science fiction. There's 2 titles I want to mention in the land of science fiction, one of which is a graphic novel, and that is Descender. Specifically Volume 1, Tin Stars, and Descenders by Jeff Lemire and Dustin Nguyen. And I loved it. I read it for the SFF BookTube Awards. It was one of the nominees for graphic novels. If anyone knows the winners, can you let me know? I can't find them. I don't see it in the Goodreads group or on the Tumblr, and I haven't read all the novels, so I didn't want to watch the live show. So I have no idea if Descender won. I hope it did. It was my favorite. It's a great, just beautiful, beautiful series, and the artwork is done with watercolors, and wow, I don't see that a lot. Not that I'm hugely, reading so many graphic novels, although way more this year, thanks to Hoopla. My goodness gracious, it is really nice to have access to graphic novels, even if it is reading them online. So that's where I do my graphic novel reading. So I've been continuing the series, but I'm not up to date. And the first one is definitely my favorite. It reminds me a lot of I, Robot, but because there's robots and it's emotional and there's a kid in it, and yeah, it reminds me of I, Robot. But anyway, still loved it. Also in the world of science fiction, I also read and loved 2001: A Space Odyssey by Arthur C. Clarke. I thought this was fabulous. I thought it would be much more confusing given the film, because the film is confusing, but the book provides so much more context. So if you found the film confusing, I definitely recommend the book. I am going to continue the series. Look, you can see. I'm going to continue the series. That'll be one of the things I want to do in 2018. Oh wow, it's crazy that 2001 has been and gone, and this was written in the 60s, and now not only it, but 2010 has come and gone. Time, it doesn't stop. It keeps going. It keeps going. Another book that I want to mention in the world of fantasy is that I finally finished the Fionavar Tapestry by Guy Gavriel Kay. This is definitely my favorite fantasy read of the year. I had gotten halfway through the series when I was younger, but never finished it, and I finished it, and I loved it, and I highly recommend it. It's such a powerful personal journeys with the characters, and then there's also, of course, a fantasy setting that is quite extraordinary, and I felt a bit different than some of the things that we see. But it does, it's one of those things that because I started it when I'm younger, I didn't see some of the things I see now when I come to books, but regardless, for me it was not only a huge accomplishment to get back to it and finish it, but I enjoyed it I was so in that book when I was reading that book. I was there. It was intense. But actually getting more here into the real world, I do have a couple more literary books. Who would have thought? The first one is The Light Between Oceans by Emil Stedman. I did this as a buddy read, and I loved it so much. Oh my goodness gracious. It's a good reminder to me not to cast out certain genres, because technically this is historical fiction, which is not something I'm drawn to a lot, but I adored this. And I think really for me the key in this book is really should I even say one of the things that I really enjoyed about this book is the characters and how they were who they were. And I know that sounds kind of simplistic, but there's something really powerful about that, and was really believable, and also at times incredibly painful about that. If you're, for some context, it is set post World War One in Australia, about a couple, and the husband tends the lighthouse, so they live on the two of them on their own, like on a small island where there's a lighthouse, and so there's a lot of, it's fabulous. I loved it. Absolutely loved it. I also absolutely love The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros. This is a sort of a collection of short stories, kind of, and I adored it. I absolutely adored it. I'm trying to remember, I might have read it for a readathon. I definitely got it on the recommendation of my brother's girlfriend slash fiance. She mentioned it to me. It also was on the Bustle list of 25 books that women should read that were released in the past 50 years. I got part of that wrong. I mentioned that list a couple of times, and so it's on that list as well, and I just adored it. It was a fabulous book. In terms of the land of things a little bit more darker, my favorite thriller of the year, I didn't read tons of them, but my favorite thriller of the year was definitely I'm Thinking of Ending Things by Ian Reid. This was a powerful, dark, compelling, smart, freaky read. I just seeped into that book, and a huge shout out to Rachel from The Shades of Orange on that one. She is the one who recommended it. I read several books this year on her recommendation and enjoyed all of them, so I highly recommend you check out her channel. But this one just, it got me. But the challenge, I do find it challenging because I want to recommend it to people, but it's so dark and disturbing that I feel like I can't just widely recommend it, so it leaves me in a bit of a weird place. So, but I loved it, so yeah, thumbs up. Also, on the darker side of things, I read Mongrels by Stephen Graham Jones. I read this during Spring Into Horror, and I found it on a Barnes & Noble best horror list or something, and I was just going through the titles, and it was the first one that came up that was available at the library, so I read it, and it was amazing. It was a coming-of-age story about, like, it's set in a family of werewolves. The story, but it's like the storytelling in this one, like the framework of the storytelling is brilliant. It's really, really well done. I highly recommend it. I enjoyed it so much. Just really, really enjoyed it. Getting to the land, actually, it was not a bad transition to things that are a bit more woo-woo. I am really happy that this year I read the Oso Zen Tarot, which is a bit of a strange read because it is a guidebook for tarot cards, so to read them start to finish is a bit strange. But I am really happy that I am reading some of my nonfiction spirituality and tarot and divination books, and I think this is the first one that I finished. I have read several of them now, so I've been just really happy to get back in the habit of doing that, and I haven't used these cards for ages. I should pick a deck to work with in 2018. I should do that. That's on the next year list. Sticking in the realm of nonfiction, I read tons of art books this year. That was like the most books that showed up again and again and again as highly rated and really loved, and just like kept on when I talked about them, and I was all like, oh my gosh, I really love this. One that was a little more like, oh, this took me forever to read, was the annotated Mona Lisa by Carol Strickland. This one actually did take me about a year to read, and it really does go through the entirety of art history, and I loved it. I absolutely adored it. It's got lots of illustrations and drawings in it, and I finally finished it. There we go. Of course, the infamous Starry Night by Van Gogh. I did have to double check. That's kind of sick. Yeah, and it had these great like post-impressionist roundups, so how you can tell each of the post-impressionists from themselves. And I've been reading a fair amount of art history books, but this is a great sort of start to finishishness thing. Well, it goes to like the 90s. But I am sad that a lot of the art books, and this makes sense, historically speaking, there's not as many women artists, but this one did have a few. So I'm hoping to sort of fill that gap in some way at some point. Another project for another day. But for today, I absolutely adored this. On a more practical side of things, I also adored 500 Handmade Books, Volume 2. My goodness gracious. I got really into sort of bookmaking this year, mostly into bookbinding. I've made a lot of my own journals and sketchbooks, started to make my own sketchbooks, and I would love to go through this book actually purely from the perspective of pulling out all of the different ways you can construct a book and then to try that out. So that's a project I want to do. This is turning into the project Shannon wants to do for 2018. Also in the land of art books is What Is It by Linda Berry. I think every year I'm going to end up having a Linda Berry book because I just love her books. And this one is actually, a lot of it is about what ideas are and thought process and where they come from. And then it's sort of interjected with some personal history, her telling her story. I'm losing all my bookmarks. Her telling her story. I feel like it's memoir-y, about her history with art and how she came to art and the challenges she faced. And then it also has exercises at the back. And I think things that you can do, which there's some crossover in terms of the book syllabus, which was all my favorites from last year. But it's just, I love it. I love it. There's nothing else like it. Speaking of something that there's nothing else like, one of my favorite books of the year was The Wander Society by Carrie Smith. And this is a I'm going all my bookmarks. This was a fascinating read. And it's really about like the idea of wandering and not having a plan and just getting out there into the world, looking at things and living at a different pace. And I really enjoyed it. It was fascinating, compelling, inspiring, and something you can do. Like, go do it. Go on that adventure that is that life. Go. And then one other art book, which I've returned to my sister. I borrowed it from my sister Jamie, and that is the Making Art a Practice by Kat Bennett. I also took a class from her, I think, last year. And it's fabulous. The book is 30 like practical things that you can do that are art practices. And I loved it. I want the book. I want to do the things. Yeah. And then in terms of the world of romance, because, you know, we haven't had a romance book here, and how much romance do I read? A lot. It's in the sort of in between 30 to 40% of the books that I read. Can you believe it? It's a lot. So my highest rated romance of the year was Warrior of Ice by Michelle Willingham. This is the first book in the Warriors of Ireland series. It's historically set romance, and it is set obviously in Ireland, and I really enjoyed it. This is part of a 2-book series, and I enjoyed the second book as well. And then I also, one of the later books that I got on a whim and loved was The Complete Fairy Tales of Oscar Wilde. Loved it. It really touched me. I was surprised. And one of the things that I loved about it is it was a fairy tale structure, but I didn't feel like there was as much a moral of the story, and a lot of fairy tales seem to be cautionary tales, a moral code, don't do this, bad things will happen if you do this, and this wasn't. This felt more like mystical things, stories. One of them could feel like, I think some of them could feel like cautionary tales, but it just let me know that that's not the only way to tell a fairy tale, and they were really beautiful. I definitely want to reread them and read more of his works, although I've read Dorian Gray, which is his only novel. And then there were a few works that I read that I loved by people I love. And two of them, first I'm going to talk about Proof of a Tongue by Sandra Allen. This is a poetry collection. I worked with Sandra years and years ago, and I decided to reread, this one's a reread, her poetry collection, and I ended up finding her on Instagram, so we have connected so many years later. She is just a wonderful person, and her poetry is beautiful and emotional and weighty and smart, and just made me feel so much, and it's been wonderful to connect with her and to see what she's up to, and I adore this collection. Really did. And also I read a couple of books that my brother wrote. Yes, I read A Triumph for Sakura, which is a vampire boxing, is about vampire boxing and a trainer who trains a non-vampire to fight vampires. And then also his most recent book, which came out this year, is Hex Rated, which is a Brimstone Files novel, and it is an urban fantasy set in the 70s following a previous child magician, like magic trick magician, but there is also magic. So yeah. So definitely want to read more of my brother's books in 2018. So many 2018 things I want to do too. So, but this was a joy to do. Did I think? Oh, I don't think I got him to sign this one. Oh, that was before I saw him. Oh, that's before I saw him. So anyway, I got to see him twice this year, which was awesome too. Anyway, so those are my favorites of 2017. I almost said 18. I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it was a long one, but that really will be my last video of the year. Let me know some of your favorites. Let me know if you did a favorites video. I would love to check it out. And that's it for 2017. I'll see you in 2018. All right, thanks for watching.